Hello, everybody. This is Sarah Scott with Leonard Muellner, looking at the HeroesX online forums and some of the questions and points of discussion that have been going on just recently. And there's some subjects we'd like to discuss a little bit further today. And the first of those is really about the idea of the Speech Act. And what constitutes a speech act? Is it the poetry? Is it things that happen within the poetry? Perhaps you can help us with that, Lenny.
Yeah. So this is an idea that that came into existence as in the context of the philosophy of Searle and in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And the basic notion is that, for example, when you get married, when you're in a marriage ceremony, and the person, the officiant, says, "Do you take this man or woman to be your duly wedded husband or wife?" and you say, "I do," that's a speech act. That's words that do things, that change your status legally and in the social context and otherwise. So it's not like chatting to your teenagers who are chatting to each other in Snapchat, okay, or adults sending each other text messages. It's language that makes a difference in reality, to give a sort of handy definition of it. And the person who's posted made several very interesting posts on this subject. I think it might be helpful for that person to know that people have been working on this as an aspect of Homeric poetry. And there's a really wonderful book on this subject by Richard P. Martin called The Language of Heroes, which shows you that in the epic language is actually a word that denotes speech act as opposed to a more neutral kind of speech, and can demonstrate, for example, when you use the expression winged words in Homer, that's what you're talking about. So within the epic diction, there's this distinction. You can actually take it farther back. In my work, I've worked on a word that means, in Homer, that means three things. It means to pray, to when in other words, you actually sacral speech to a god or a goddess. It also means when you're on the field of battle, what you say to a warrior, which is meant to do something to them. Okay. And it also is used once only in Homer, and then attested one other time in Linear B tablets to mean to make a legal assertion. So you can see this is a word for speech act. It goes back to an Indo-European root that really, in Sanskrit, this word is a goddess, and the name of a goddess. And so the concept of language that has consequences in reality, and that answers to this distinction between speech acts and all other kinds of language, is something that probably goes very far back in the history of Western culture. And I did want to say, I hope that's interesting and helpful. And I did want to say something about the example that the poster was. I wasn't totally clear what point of view the poster was taking about Odyssey 1. I think it's 325, where you're describing the singing of Phemius, and the language is Noston Aeda. He was singing Nostos, and the poster seems to take issue with the translation. He was singing a homecoming instead of he was singing a song of a homecoming. But I think that the language of the poet describing poetic activity in Homer is very specific and precise, and the parallel is something that the poster also came up with, which is the beginning of the Iliad, where the poet invokes the muse and asks the muse to sing the Maenus of Achilles. It's exactly the same kind of syntax, and I wouldn't make a distinction between the muse singing and the poet singing. They're interactive processes in every way. So the language is the same, and I think I would argue that if you think sing the anger of Achilles is a speech act, then you also have to say sing the Nostos is describing a speech act. So that kind of parallelism between the language in the prologue and the language describing song in Homer is very consistent with the whole way that the poetry works. That is, the diction about song and the diction in prologues and about singing and about invoking the muse are all of a piece. Okay.
And there are other kinds of speech act within the poem itself as well.
Yes, there are lots of them. I think the poster gives a very good set of examples of what speech acts are. And you know, some people argue that poetry itself, especially in these archaic societies, is a speech act. In other words, it's recreating. It's not just telling a story, which is something quite removed from reality, but re-invoking and realizing in the audience's mind that reality. So telling a myth, for example, is quite a different sort of thing in many societies from telling a story. It has sacral and religious consequences as well as consequences for the community. So I think there's a lot to be said about thinking about this distinction and what language means in this culture, and something that people have worked a lot on, as well as Professor Nash. But again, I'd recommend that a book by Richard Martin. It's a beautiful book and extremely engaging, not difficult to read. It's available online, actually, on the CHS website. Okay, so you don't even have to buy it.
Yep. Yeah, we'll put a link to the
okay, great.
text. Yeah. Okay, thank you. So the next thing we were looking at was thinking about women, which is a subject that quite often comes up. And is there a difference, for example, between the way women are portrayed in the Odyssey and the Iliad? What can we tell about the role of women and how it was seen in society and in the context of song culture?
Yeah, so I think it's important to make that distinction between the way they're portrayed in the song culture and the way they are in reality. It's very tricky to make conclusions about the reality from the song culture. Okay, in other words, it could be the same, it could be different, it could be totally upside down, and there's no way to predict, okay, from internally looking at the song culture. But so I think all I would advise is caution on that subject, on making any assumptions from what's in the song culture about what the reality is at any given point in the performance tradition of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that means from the, say, the 7th century BCE up until the 2nd century CE, when people were still performing the Iliad and the Odyssey to audiences. So and there are a lot of social change. There's a lot of social change going on during this period of social and political upheaval, the influence of Roman society on Greek civilization in the later periods, and all sorts of other things. So you can't just say this is the way I think it looks like this in reality from the poetry. But within the poetry itself, I think you made a point about that things seem to be different in the Odyssey from the Iliad. Are there particular things that you would point to from your experience of the poetry and of the way in which people talk about this in the forums?
Yes, I think certainly at the beginning of the Iliad, we see women being used as prizes of war. Right. We also see them as perhaps family members, but very much looking on in a battle situation. Right. In the Odyssey, we have powerful women and/or goddesses who are more independent in some ways. Penelope is running a household. And I think the example of Arete is another example of somebody who seems to be very important in her own right.
Yeah, no, I think these are very different. The women are, I think in the Iliad, you're absolutely right. That is, you're in a besieged city or in an army situation. and the women don't have any kind of central role in a warrior culture, because at least as far as the Iliad is concerned, there are no women warriors. The Iliad doesn't tell us the story about the Amazon queen, for example, and Achilles, which we know was part of the tradition. So just to take the beginning of the Iliad, it's not only is Briseis unwilling to go to Agamemnon, but the heralds are unwilling to go and get her, and everybody seems, as well as Achilles and Patroclus, being not very happy about the whole process. So we have a whole sort of thing where, and the major thing that women do, however, in the Iliad is lament, right? This is a very important part of feminine culture, and that's basically their role in the poem. Even Helen has a central function as a lamenter at the end of the Iliad, and I don't think, I think we do see women in that role in the Odyssey as well. I think one of the things about Penelope is that she spends a lot of time weeping, right? Yeah. And back not so long ago, a young scholar named Olga Levaniouk showed that Penelope's name, which is, if you look it up if you look up Penelops, which is where it obviously comes from in the Liddell Scott dictionary, it means a kind of a duck. But Olga Levaniouk went and looked up what this duck does. And what the duck does is to weep and wail, okay? So even built into her name is the culture of lament, which is we were talking about speech acts, and laments are very highly significant forms of speech in this culture, and not something to be sneezed at. But I think that's a really important ingredient in the portrayal of her as a person, and not to be missed. Okay, but she is a woman, as you say, who doesn't play the same kind of subservient role that the prize women, who are essentially slaves. Okay, the notion, I don't think there's much of a difference between for Briseis and Chryseis and notion of a slave later on in Greek culture. They're captive women. There's a beautiful book by another member of our group, Casey Douay, on captive women. I know you've had some interviews with her, and she can tell you a lot about them and their relationship to laments too. I mean, one of the amazing things that Briseis does is to sing a lament for Patroclus in the Iliad, and so I think those are aspects of the identity of women that are persistent. But the role in which that someone like Arete or Penelope herself, I mean, there is a debate in scholarship about whether she gets, there's some language just saying that she gets kleos in the Odyssey just as much as her husband, and there are some very interesting books on this subject written recently to understand how she's portrayed as a figure, her ability to choose and not to choose, and to make decisions, which you don't see women doing that there in the Iliad, right? And with Arete, you also have a very special person whose origins are the subject of the work of Douglas Frame. I think I'd recommend people, if you're interested in her as a character, to read what he has to say in relationship to the cult of the goddess Athena in Athens. Very interesting parallels. But her name means she who is prayed to, Arete. Okay, it's not related to the word for excellence, which is Arete. So I think that the poster is right, that in her case especially, she has a role that's signally important and equal to that of her husband. But it's a complex picture, right? Isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there are all kinds of women doing different things. There are goddesses, for example, Calypso and Circe, who are powerful figures in the poem, but who are represented also as being subject to male power dominance in their own world, right? They have to do things because of Hermes or Zeus or stuff like that, right? It's hard to get away from the patriarchal nature of this culture, and I don't think we should gloss over it, right? But still, I think you are dealing with women in different cultural contexts in the Odyssey, and therefore who have a much more expansive identity and character, right? I think that's fair. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's a helpful way of thinking about it. I think as we continue to read.
Okay.
Then there's a couple of posts that are talking about things like the opposites, for example, with Odysseus on land and on sea, and then also sort of integration, reintegration, and then the opposites of decay and hubris, and how all that kind of meshes together. And
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, I think the end of the Odyssey, you know, even almost explicitly looks back at the Iliad itself too, right? And it sort of winds up the whole, because you have that discussion between Achilles and Agamemnon about things, and sort of retrospective look at the whole epic tradition. But I think, you know, the poster who wrote about the family integration and the sort of the way in which Odysseus' encounter with Laertes goes from people who are missing each other, who are not recognizing each other, and who are not taking care of themselves. Laertes is taking care of his orchard, which is a beautiful metaphor for, you know, fertility and growth and well-being. Even in the epic, you talk about a society that's functioning well under its king is fertile, right? And the plants grow. And you've also seen by now, some of you, the description of the golden age in Hesiod and how stuff is growing and stuff like that. This notion of heroes and their relationship to vegetation is an important background theme in all of this stuff. So the orchard of Laertes is a powerful metaphor, and the way you go from a conflictive and a hostile situation into an integration. And for Odysseus, it's obviously on multiple levels. This is with his son first, with his wife then, and then with his father. And so there's this kind of beautiful metaphor for family integration. And there are other things going on too at the end of the Odyssey, involving these sorts of themes in a sacral or religious way. Maybe take us too long to go into them, but I think there are underlying themes about sacrificial animals, goats. There's a lot of talk about goats and pigs, and you even have a cow herd involved, Philoetios, in the end of the Odyssey, and these are sacrificial animals. There's something important about the sacrificial purification of the home, okay, that goes from a situation of total chaos and the massacre of these people to some sort of purification, and then this forced integration of the whole society with the family, with the ruling family, if you can use such terms, at the very end of the poem, which I think is very important. Somebody complained that it didn't seem right. It seemed like too nice an ending, but I think those sorts of feelings are things to look at. In other words, if it doesn't seem right to you, why is it right in the context of the poem? There's something that we're missing if it doesn't seem to fit your expectations. It's not that there's something wrong with the poem. So I think looking at these things in the context of the hero cult and of the contrast between conflict and myth and integration and ritual, those are important themes in the poetry and important themes in daily life in Greece, right? In the cult of heroes, as Professor Nage's description makes clear. So these can be ways of pointing at things that are not explicitly discussable in the poetry, and And I think there are some very interesting ideas brought up in the forum about just these points. This notion of, would you like to respond to that? Are there things that I've said that are interesting, or other things that I haven't that would be worth talking about?
Yes, hold on one sec. The other point that was being talked about was this decay versus
hubris. Yes, exactly.
And the relationship between land and sea. Is that a definite
so I think
distinction, or is it more complex than that?
No, I think that decay and hubris is extremely important in the Odyssey. Okay, I think that there is one of the members of our research group, Laura Slatkin, once said, and I was particularly struck by this, that when it comes to Hesiod, there are these two poems, the Works and Days and the Theogony, and she said that the Theogony, it looks like the prologue to the Iliad, and the Works and Days, the prologue to the Odyssey. And I think what she has in mind was the fact that the Works and Days stresses, as the post did, so much this theme of the contrast between decay and hubris. You have these words used of the suitors, that they're purveyors of hubris in every way, and the notion that Odysseus returns the society to its norms, okay, and to a situation in which the society is integrated and can flourish anew is very important. So also is the notion. I think it's important to think of the apologoi, the story of Odysseus's wanderings, are looking at societies that have very different rules from the Greek ones. Okay, and when you're talking about concepts of justice, okay, this is a heavy-duty word for us and a very culturally conditioned one. Okay, it's easy to show in Homer that, for example, the derivative of dikaios, means polite in Homer. Okay, it has to do with etiquette. So what we're talking about is the social rules and what are recognizable social rules. And when Odysseus goes to all these places where the rules are turned upside down and inside out, and there are wild variations on them, what are we learning about? We're learning, in a certain sense, all of that justifies the way Greeks do things, okay, in an ethnocentric way, okay, but also it's about the hero's ability to negotiate all these things and still survive. There's a lot of things going on, but it too is a variation on this notion of what's just and proper behavior. Maybe we better translate just as proper, and what's hubris, which, as I think you all know, doesn't just mean violent or sinful. Okay, it has to do with certain ways of unregulated behavior, right? And ways that are related to plant life and seasonality and other things, right? So the Odyssey really has all sorts of built-in variations on this theme and is very interested in exploring it. And I think that's a very insightful comment and a good one to keep in mind. The terminology about hubris especially is there, and the way in which you can understand the integration that is the goal of the Odyssey. After all, one of the things that you need to do to understand a text is to figure out what is the end result, okay? What is trying to point to? And I think the Iliad has its own sort of resolution and integration in mind, which is also very interesting in these terms, right? But it's quite different from the resolution that I think. If I would say something here that may be out of bounds, but I think the Iliad is more about getting us to a state that's previous or prior to the Odyssey. It's about warrior society. It's not about civil society. And it's about getting the world into some sort of, the human world into some kind of definition that you end up with at the end. That is, what humans are capable of is distinct from gods, and how how life can be viewed. Okay, and there are lots of transgressive characters, including the hero himself. Okay, Odysseus is not that sort of a person. He's a person who explores different ways of constructing a society, right, and ends up in his own, trying to bring it together from being in a deregulated state. So this is these are broad strokes, maybe too broad strokes, but interestingly, I hope maybe can inspire some discussion about ways of looking at the contrast between the poems. And so I think that's a very powerful theme. The other thing you mentioned, you talked about hubris and decay and something else.
The difference between land and sea, where sea is perhaps less integrated in some way.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, this person also talked about the coincidence of opposites, and you have that even in Odysseus's relationship to the sea, right? His major enemy is the god of the sea, right? The person whom he's interacting with. So here you have that kind of notion of going from conflict to resolution. And the beautiful story that very clearly, lucidly analyzed in a post about the integration that the planting of the oar, which is mistaken for a winnowing fan in a place where they don't know about the sea and stuff like that. This is really another example of the way in which opposites interact and result in some kind of a resolution.
There's talk, I think, in the later part of Works and Days, which is not sort of on our reading list, so to speak, but I had a look at it out of curiosity.
Okay, yeah, I forgot that. Yeah, okay.
The poem talks quite a lot about the correct way of doing things, and that includes sort of the right time to bring the boat in.
Exactly.
The time not to sail. As well as time to deal with things on the land. So there is an acknowledgement that the sea is still part of that world.
Right. I mean, the Hesiodic tradition is very hostile to sea travel, and at the same time, there are funny things there about it. Okay, there are places in which the sea is talked about as a source of food and wealth. So it's a mixed picture, but the notion that sea travel is negative and dangerous is a very old one and a long-lasting one. You find it's a motif in Greek and Roman poetry as well. So this distrust of it and fear of the sea as an uncontrollable natural element, totally understandable. To anyone who's ever been on a boat.
One of the epithets of the sea is something like unharvested.
Unharvested, yes, yeah. Exactly. And the Indo-Europeans were not eaters of fish, right? The Indo-European fish is landlocked salmon. Okay, that's why it's so weird that the only fish that gets eaten in the Homeric poems is when the men are stuck and on the island of the cattle of the sun, right, and actually go fishing, right? I think fish eat people rather than people eating fish in the Odyssey. But I'm getting away from the subject here. But I think there's a historical aspect to the discomfort with the sea as well. I think Poseidon is the god of the sea, but also of rivers, I think it's important to say. So he's a fresh and saltwater god, and one shouldn't forget that.
Yes, and rivers are okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Very necessary.
Yes, rivers can be treacherous to traverse as well, and can be frontiers and things like that. So they have complex significance as well. But so
So as always, it's helpful to look at the way the poetry talks about these things and compare it to the way those sorts of terms are used in other contexts.
Exactly. I mean, there is that this epithet of the sea, which may mean, and probably does mean, unharvested. There's also a kind of kenning. This notion of kennings that you have in Irish poetry. These are like epithets that become sort of riddles. So there's a kenning once in Homer for the land, which is he trafere, that which nourishes. Okay, you don't. It's a way of describing it without saying what it is exactly. So there is this built-in contrast between the sea, which one doesn't produce food, and that which does. Yeah. So I think these are big underlying cultural and sacral and mythical and symbolic themes in contrast. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lenny. There's so much to think about and talk about, but I think
Likewise.
we'll have to stop there for this week.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.